Thank you. Item G is the wastewater treatment plant, Phase 5, Predesign Study Contract Amendment. And the reason I wanted this pulled is because this is, I think, a pretty important item that all the folks of Moscow be aware of what's going on. It has to do with the cooling of our effluent as it's discharged into Paradise Creek so that we can meet, first of all, the state of Washington standards, which are guided through EPA. I didn't think, Les, that it was really necessary to have this big slide presentation and all that, but if you could kind of just go into what we're looking at and our options, and so just kind of advise everybody as what's going on.
Certainly. The wastewater treatment plant for the city of Moscow operates under a permit that's established and issued by the Environmental Protection Agency out of Seattle. That permit stipulates what levels of pollutants, if you will, can be discharged from a wastewater treatment plant into the receiving water body, which is Paradise Creek. One of those items that is stipulated within that permit deals with temperature. What is the temperature of the water coming out of the wastewater treatment plant and going into the creek? The city has undertaken a number of improvement projects at the wastewater treatment plant to deal with a variety of issues that are within those regulations under that permit. Temperature is really the remaining one. And so we've been moving forward with efforts to ensure that we can meet temperature standards on a consistent basis. And as part of that, we've undertaken what we have titled the Predesign study for the wastewater treatment plant Phase 5 improvements. Now, that pre-design study is something that we have been working on the last couple of years. It looked at 17 different identified options for dealing with temperature coming out of the wastewater treatment plant, then reduced those to about 5 contenders, if you will, then actually developed a few hybrid options as well, and in the end came up with really 3 primary contenders for possible solutions to improvements for temperature at the treatment plant. Those 3 solutions all involve something called evaporative cooling, which uses a pond that stores the water for a period of time, uses the atmosphere and climatic conditions to cool that water before it is then handled and released. One of those options also includes a wetlands treatment facility. So the item that is before you this evening is an amendment to the contract that was issued to JUB for the pre-design study about 2 years ago. And that amendment will add some additional services to help the city with some pilot studies to be undertaken this summer to look at the evaporative cooling systems and a wetland system in our climate, in our situation, our soils, our plant types, things of that nature, to get a better handle on whether evaporative cooling and wetlands are truly effective cooling methods here in Moscow. And so the 2 pilot studies would be to bring in a evaporative cooling tower that would replicate a cooling pond, and to provide flow through an existing wetlands facility out near the treatment plant that could be monitored to then also assess the effects of a wetlands on that water or on water passing through it, both in terms of temperature and other constituents. So the item on your consent agenda is that modification of that contract, support services from JUB to help us in performing those 2 pilot studies this summer.
Other questions for Les?
I do.
Walter's got one. Listen.
Les, what's the amount of the contract amendment?
I believe it sits at, make me look it up, 76. Total of $79,000, including a $5,000 management reserve.
Thank you.
Wayne?
Originally, my understanding on the cooling of the water was Paradise Creek itself had to meet a certain temperature standard, but from what I'm reading here, It's actually our effluent discharge temperature that we have to be able to control, and not so much as trying to change, how do I want to put this? We can only do so much to cool Paradise Creek. They came up with a temperature of 17 degrees Celsius, which is, what, about 64 degrees or so Fahrenheit. I guess my question, Les, is how did they come up with that temperature?
Yeah, there are actually two components. The first is the creek itself, what's a natural temperature within a water body of that nature. Now, each state sets standards for that. Idaho has its own, Washington has its own, and those are the standards that are then used when you look at point dischargers like the city of Moscow with the treatment plant where they have one pipe discharging to the creek. It's a point discharger. Looking at those kind of entities in terms of what temperature, effluent, or flow can they put into the creek. So for Paradise Creek, there was a study done in Idaho back in the 90s that said, here's the creek, here's what it can handle, here's what the habitat is, and here's what we want to be able to support in terms of habitat. Now, the bit of the oddity here is due to our proximity to the Washington state line, under federal regulations, we have to comply with the downstream state standards because of close proximity. So because our discharge is so close to the state line, in essence, we have to meet Washington standards, which are more stringent than Idaho. That's a standard that was set across the state of Washington for what's called a Class A water body, which is that it's actually an 18-degree temperature standard for really as a default temperature for most types of fish habitat throughout the state. So that's where the creek standard comes from. Then our standard for our effluent has to work within that. So we cannot discharge in a way that raises that temperature above that standard from the state of Washington.
So are we making an assumption then that at that period of time that the creek water is already at approximately the discharge temperature that we would be using?
Not necessarily.
It could be higher.
There are certainly times in the summer when the creek flows are very low and temperatures are high that the water temperature would exceed that 18 degrees.
So my assumption would be that as Paradise Creek comes into the city limits of Moscow, it more than likely is higher than that temperature.
There are times when there's no flow coming into the city of
Okay.
Moscow.
The place I have a difficult time understanding is if we chose to not discharge whatsoever into Paradise Creek,
Yes.
if we used it for all purple pipe for irrigation purposes such as University of Idaho, or it was all through percolation through the ground, this type of thing, there's no discharge in Paradise Creek, we would not be affecting Paradise Creek in any way, shape, or form. It would cross the state line at whatever temperature it had,
That's correct.
which would be higher than the 17 degrees Celsius, most likely.
At certain times of the year, that's true.
Now I have an issue with why we have to change the natural temperature of that water and spend the amount of money that we do. That was the point I wanted to make.
If I may, that's a question that's been raised a lot within the region. We were part of a watershed resource inventory area assessment done through Washington State over the last 10 years, and that was an item that was addressed repeatedly. And I can tell you that the Washington State Department of Ecology is studying Paradise Creek and the South Fork of the Palouse River to determine if that temperature standard is appropriate. And the preliminary findings that we're hearing from them is that it is probably not appropriate, and it should probably be higher. We're still waiting on the Department of Ecology to modify, or basically to finish their study and come up with a final recommendation to go through their state process to reset the temperature standard for the South Fork of Paradise Creek in the state of Washington. It may be 19 or 20 degrees, we're not sure yet, but their preliminary indications are that it's likely to change.
Thank you.
Walter. Thank you. Now he's got me going.
Got John going, too. He had his hand up.
Les, if the creek is at a high temperature, let's say for whatever reason it's coming through town at 100 degrees, I can't deal with centigrade, are we responsible for lowering the temp of the creek or not raising the, what are they measuring? Are they measuring our effluent or are they measuring the creek itself, regardless of what we're putting into it?
They really measure both in that the Clean Water Act deals with temperature within water bodies in the United States. So they're looking at the creek temperature, okay, from a holistic perspective. What is it? What should it be? How can we get there collectively? For the city of Moscow, our only responsibility is to deal with our effluent. So that's what is monitored at our discharge pipe to make sure that we are meeting the standard that's set under our permit. If the creek is still too warm, that's not really our problem.
Okay.
Because we're doing what we're required to do. There may be other issues that need to be dealt with.
Okay, thank you.
John, you had a question?
Are we going to spend this $80,000 before we know what the state of Washington is going to do about their temperature limits? Or are we going to wait until they have told us what the temperature limits are, see what we're doing, and then decide whether we do need to spend the money or not?
As far as the pilot studies, they are somewhat seasonally sensitive, so really we're looking for summer season. We need to check the ability of these two techniques to cool water during really July and August when the temperatures are highest and creek temperatures are up and creek flows are down. So we're tied into the seasonal aspect for doing pilot studies. The other thing to keep in mind is we need to continue to make progress towards improving our ability to treat temperature. And it's really regardless of what the state of Washington is doing. So the short answer is yes, we will spend this before they finish their process, because they're a little ways out yet. They have to finish their studies, and eventually it works its way through a legislative process to come up with any new standard.
So it's a necessary expenditure whether we spend it now or a year from now.
Right, and part of it is figuring out what the capability of these systems are. So even if the standard does change, we then know what we need to build to meet perhaps a new standard if there's one set.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tom?
Thank you. I understand that the question before us is adopting the contract amendment agreement to test these two systems, either the cooling tower system or the wetland system. Of the 17 choices that we had, my favorite two were using more of the effluent, using a higher percentage, if not all of it, at least during those warm weather months, which would effectively remove the problem, or pumping it or piping it underground to take advantage of the natural cooling effect of the ground. We've talked about this before, right? Or perhaps even putting it in upstream somewhere so that we're, trying to take advantage of natural cooling of the ground and then perhaps using it later. Are those options completely off the table, or is there some opportunity for either using more of the effluent or using underground piping to help further bring down the temperature?
Well, at this point, I'd say none of the options are completely off the table. I mean, part of what the idea of the study was to determine which ones were the most feasible, socially, economically,
Sure.
environmentally, right on down the line. And the ones that we're looking at, the final three, if you will, are the ones that really came out on top in those types of criteria assessments. One of those does include land application. And so essentially expanding what we're doing at the University of Idaho now to put more water onto irrigation in some form. For the most part, it would be in the vicinity of the treatment plant to keep the overall cost down. The idea of the kind of a geothermal exchange, that was one that we did look at fairly heavily as well. It had enough issues associated with cost and reliability that I think it's part of why it fell by the wayside in the overall assessments.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, with that, Mr. Mayor, I'll make a motion to accept item G on the consent agenda.
Okay.
I'll second.
John Wayne's motion, John's second. We will start with Art.
Aye.
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 Okay, and that is done. It completes our consent